Greetings, we are in Junior English, and our objective today is to discuss the really important poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. I'm with you on page 928, 929. Now, I'm going to point out something about this writer, and right away at the top of your annotations, you kind of want to put a star here. We're working with one of the most important poets of the 20th century. When you're studying with me as juniors, you are studying American writers. Are you ready for this? Next year, when you study with me as seniors, you will study British writers. Maybe some of you have seen your pals walking around as seniors with a purple lit textbook as opposed to this one. In that purple lit textbook of British authors, there is a poet named T.S. Eliot. We're going to study him next year. A British author named T.S. Eliot. We're studying in our junior year an American author named T.S. Eliot. Jot down in your notes what's going on here. How is it possible in our junior year we're studying an American poet named T.S. Eliot, and in our senior year we're going to study a British poet named T.S. Eliot? And it's the same guy. Loke says it's the same guy. It ain't like it's his somehow a relative. It's the same guy. Now, if you say, well, he must have traveled in America or in England. Way wrong answer. Because lots and lots of writers who are American authors traveled and lived in England and in Europe. The biography is really important to understanding T.S. Eliot. Let's go through it quickly, shall we? Eliot is born in America. You can't get more Midwestern than St. Louis. He's a young prodigy. He's really bright. He ends up at Harvard. He's great with language. So he learns languages pretty quickly. So for example, he wanted to read Dante's Inferno, so he taught himself Italian. He wanted to read the Vedic scriptures of the Hindu religion in Sanskrit, so he taught himself Sanskrit. You can kind of get the picture here. He leaves Harvard, and he leaves the United States, and he moves to England, where he takes British citizenship. He starts dressing up to look like a British man. He tries to change his voice from Midwestern America to have a British accent, all of that kind of thing. And he starts writing poetry. The important man in T.S. Eliot's life is a poet named Ezra Pound. What poem are we familiar with Pound? You remember? In the Metro. You got it, right? Pounds at the time was kind of like the poet living in England that helped young poets get their start. He got a letter and a poem from a guy he had not heard of named T.S. Eliot. That poem's name was The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Ezra Pound said about that poem two things. I got no idea what it says. I got no idea what it means. None. This is a professional poet who says this about this poem. But the second thing he says is more intriguing. He says, I have a sense it's genius. I have a sense that it is genius. Even though I don't understand really what it means, I can't help but believe I'm reading a really important poet. Pounds then turns around and helps T.S. Eliot discover his poetic voice. And in 1922, this is a huge date for us in literature. You want to write it down. In 1922, T.S. Eliot will publish the most famous poem of the 20th century, a poem called Wasteland. Okay, Wasteland. We'll study it as seniors. As juniors, we only look at one poem of T.S. Eliot's, and it's this one, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. For our work together, we want to concentrate on this work as a work of modernist poetry. So write that down. Now that's important to us, isn't it, Miss Bernard? Because we have to write a poem and we have to explain why it's modernist, right? So we'll actually look at a poem that we will qualify as modernist, okay? And then once we kind of start to study this poem, we'll maybe get a little bit of an idea of what's going on. Now, one of the things that makes this a modernist poem is listed for you right there on 929. Look at it with me. 929. Under literary analysis, we're now working at 2B, aren't we? We're working at 2B in your annotations. Stream of consciousness. Now, what's that all about? The great Viennese psychiatrist Sigmund Freud said the following. The human mind is actually not one mind. There's a whole bunch of minds going on at the same time. He said it something like this. You know how on ESPN you can watch like what's going on the screen, but along the bottom, that stuff is running that like gives you scores and stuff like that? Are y'all familiar with how they do that on ESPN and stuff, right? Where they run it along the bottom, okay? Here's what Freud, F-R-E-U-D, Freud said about the human mind. He said, for example, Braxton's standing there, sitting there. If we were to somehow get inside of Braxton's head and to look at his thoughts, and to look at his thoughts by reading them, the way we read stuff along the bottom of an ESPN screen, Freud said two things about those thoughts of Braxton. Two things. One, the first thing he said was, it wouldn't be one line of thoughts that would be going across Braxton's mind right now. Freud said there's multiple ones happening all at the same time. All at the same time. He's not just thinking one strand of thoughts right now. He's thinking multiple strands of thought all at the same time. Braxton says, no, I'm not. Freud says, no, you don't understand. Almost all of the stuff you're thinking right now, he says, is unconscious. Later, Freud never used the term. The term will get used as sub or below the conscious. In other words, there's this stuff you're aware of that you're thinking, and then there's all this stuff that you're unaware of that you're thinking. Where would Freud get an idea like that? Well, in 1900, he publishes his classic book, Interpretation of Dreams. He says dreams is a classic example of how he says, I know this is true about Braxton. Because when Braxton is dreaming, he dreams multiple kinds of thoughts, and they're all happening at the same time. You've all dreamed and been aware that you had these bizarre thoughts. That's the first thing he would say. Multiple minds, multiple strands of thinking. So, for example, we would say to Braxton, oh, you're thinking this. And he would say, no, I'm not. And we'd start reading it out loud. Oh, you're thinking this. And he'd say, no, I'm not. And he literally is unaware that he's thinking those things. And yet he is. Number two, Freud said, the majority of these lines are going to center around a couple of powerful emotions. One is fear or anxiety, which is why some of you right now are sitting there biting on your nails. Sorry about that. Or biting on your pen cap. Or biting on some string. Or biting on some kind of candy. Freud said, we're anxious. We're worried. For those of you who know the film Wall-E, Wall-E hands. We're worried. We're always worried. What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? Some of us will say, I don't feel that way, but Tashima's got his hand in his mouth. See, Freud will say, no. Back to Braxton's first observation. He's unaware of the anxiety of all of that. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Of course, one of the greatest fears for us is that someday we have to die. And because we know people who have already died, death for us is constantly a concern for us. All you have to do is go back and look at your third grade picture and realize, whoa, that was like a few years ago. And I don't look the same now as I did back then. Right. And 10 years from now, guess what? You're not going to look the same as you look today. And 50 years from now, guess what? See how that works? But notice I didn't say in 200 years. Why? Because in 200 years, you ain't going to be here. And Freud said, we know this at a deep psychic level, and it bugs us. Anxiety is this word. Okay? We have lots of anxiety. Another word he would often use is dread, which it kind of makes sense. You know, worry. And that dread and anxiety can lead to alienation. Makes sense. Where, for example, you don't want to fall in love with anyone because you know if I fall in love with somebody, I'm ultimately going to have to leave that somebody, or he or she's going to have to leave me through death. That's just the way it works. And I want to be sad, so I'm not going to get close to anybody. This alienation thing can happen, Freud said, rather easily. The other thing that Freud said is going to be aggression, fighting, rage. And of course, attuned to that is issues of sexuality. Freud said both males and females are thinking about sex all the time. But by the way, it's not because they want a hanky-panky. For Freud, it's fundamental Darwinism. We are a species that evolves for Freud, and by definition, we're always looking to procreate so that we can continue the species. And in that regards, everything is about sex. We're constantly thinking about sex all the time. But notice how these two things come together. Sex and fear, or sex and anxiety, come very close together, don't they? Worry. And we're not just talking about, am I going to get a prom date or not? Obviously, we're talking about something a little bit bigger than that. Prom, it's a thing where you go out on a date. No, I'm just explaining. So Braxton smiles. So there you go. That's an introduction to Freud. Now, are you ready for this? I'll bring this now to a conclusion. Dude, how did you get on Freud? By looking on 929, stream of consciousness. Did you see the word stream? You wrote it down at 2A. Or I'm sorry, at 2B. Stream. Another word is river. Freud said Braxton's mind is like the Bighorn River. This is another word picture. It's a cool word picture. If right now we were to go out to the Bighorn River, and it's thought so we could do this, you would notice there's different parts of that river. Out in the middle of the river, the water runs a certain way. Off to the banks, where it's muddy and gunky, right? Different kind of water there. He said the mind is like a river or a stream. And there's all this stuff going on all the time in that river. The influence of Freud for writers was to invent what's called stream of consciousness writing. It's simply this. The attempt, you want to put this in your notes, the attempt to try to articulate or say what actually is in Braxton's mind right now. Okay? So for example, if Ms. Cottrell was going to write a story, and she was going to tell about the last 10 minutes in our class, but she was going to tell about it from Braxton's perspective, from his mind. But she's not going to have Braxton say anything out loud. He's just sitting there. That's all he did for the last 10 minutes. What Cottrell's going to do is imagine all of the different thoughts that are inside of Braxton's head. And she's simply going to write those thoughts. Well, some of what Cottrell writes could be very controversial. Why? Because, for example, she might write about things that are uncomfortable, against the rules. She might mention some things about sexuality. And when she publishes it in 1900, there are going to be a lot of people who might be really offended. Freud's ideas will have a tremendous effect in stream of consciousness. Let's list the big guns of stream of consciousness. Experimental writing. Obviously, Eliot's one of them.
But how would you have any idea of how to comprehend what would be going on?
It's right. Therein lies the experiment, right? There's no way Cottrell will ever really know what's in Braxton's mind. She's going to make it up, isn't she? Right? That's what we mean. Put it in your notes. That's what we mean by experimental. She is experimenting as she writes. The most important experimentalists with stream of consciousness, Virginia Woolf, a British author. We'll mention her next year as a senior. In America, there's two really important stream of consciousness writers. One of them is named Faulkner. We'll get to Faulkner. Okay. He's a really important writer in the American tradition, and he tries to capture what's going on in the mind of someone. The most important stream of consciousness writer, though, is James Joyce. Joyce. We'll talk about him as seniors. Joyce, in 1922, publishes a novel, that's stream of consciousness. Notice it's the same year Wasteland was published. In the same year, the most important poem and the most important novel in the 20th century are published. 1922, James Joyce will publish it. He was a huge fan of Eliot's work. And he calls it Ulysses. It's an 800-page novel that tells about the thoughts of a single character for a single day. Of course, here's the thing. If Cottrell really wanted to try and write about all the things that Braxton was thinking about in the last 10 minutes, Freud would say Braxton thought literally thousands of pages of words. Braxton says, no, I did not. Wait, you didn't hear me. Freud said most of what you're thinking, you're unaware of that you're thinking. Okay? So, for example, right now, especially those of you who are biting on yourselves, if we were to start to ask you why, like, what are you worried about? Dude, I'm not worried about anything. Really? Well, let's talk about what's coming up in your future that you're excited about or concerned about or stressed out about. And all of a sudden you start talking about it with a therapist, for example. Remember, Freud invents that whole thing of psychoanalysis. And all of a sudden you go, oh, yeah, I guess I am kind of anxious and worried about that. Oh, yeah, this thing's coming up. Ball players, they're acutely aware of this when you start talking to them. And they start talking about what they're thinking about. And all of a sudden they start saying it out loud. Well, I'm thinking about this and this and this and this. Guess what? Freud said you're thinking about all those things simultaneously. If you were to try and write all those thoughts down, right, it would be very experimental. It might be very controversial. In 1922, when Joyce publishes Ulysses, that novel is banned. It's outlawed in America because of some of the stuff that's inside of that novel. Okay, obviously very controversial topics of sexuality and the like. Let's now turn to T.S. Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I've given you enough of an introduction so that now we're ready to go to work. We're going to work with this poem today, maybe a little tomorrow. We'll see what I do for time. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, again, just to remind, we are here to learn how to read. That's our focus, okay? So we will spend some time now looking specifically at this poem and asking ourselves, dude, what is going on? The place we start is to read it, then we'll try and exegete it. So you ought to have your book in front of you. Now, while I read, you want to pay close attention. So read along with me. This is the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I'm on page 930. Is everyone ready? Here we go. A stream of consciousness, experimental poem, really important poem in the history of poetry, especially modernist poetry. No poem like this had ever been written before, which is why Ezra Pound said, I've never read anything like this before. Let's take a look at it. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. And indeed, there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create, and time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you, and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my color, mounting firmly to the chin. My necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pen. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. For I have known them all already, known them all. Have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I've measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall beneath the music from a further room. So how should I presume? And I've known the eyes already, known them all. The eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And when I am formulated, sprawling on a pen, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the buttons of my days and ways, and how should I presume? And I've known the arms already, known them all. Arms that are braceleted and white and bare, but in the lamplight downed with light brown hair. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? Arms that lie along a table or wrap about a shawl. And should I then presume? And how should I begin? Shall I say, I have gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows? I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And the afternoon, the evening, sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it may linger stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. I've seen the moment of my greatness flicker, And I've seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker. And in short, I was afraid. And would it have been worth it after all? After the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me, would it have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I am Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to tell you all. I shall tell you all. If one, settling a pillow by her head, should say, that is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. And would it have been worth it after all? Would it have been worthwhile after the sunsets and the dooryards and the sprinkled streets, after the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor, and this and so much more? It is impossible to say just what I mean. But as if a magic lantern through the nerves and patterns on a screen, would it have been worthwhile if one, settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl and turning toward the window, should say, that is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. Am an attendant lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two. Advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times, indeed, almost ridiculous. Almost at times, the fool. I grow old. I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they will sing to me. I've seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown till human voices wake us and we drown. Now, it is altogether possible that you share the sentiment a junior once shared when she said it out loud. Mr. McGee, I heard you read it, and I even stayed awake for most of it to follow along. But you might as well have stood in the front of 303 and gone, because that's all that means to me. And I have no idea, and you're telling me that this is one of the greatest poems of the 20th century. Wait a minute, I already told you something else. The great American expatriate poet Ezra Pound said about this poem, I got no idea what this poem is about, but somehow, he said, I have the sense that there's genius behind this poem. There's something going on, there's a haunting rhythm, and something's up. Well, let's see if we can exegete, shall we? Now, clearly, let's say it out loud. I don't have much for time, and we're not going to be able to get through this poem at every level, are we? I mean, obviously, scholars spend a long time working with this. One of the ways I came to this poem actually was in my youth in university, and I was in a poetry class being lectured by a pretty famous poet actually, and I hate to admit it, Braxton, but I was kind of daydreaming, and I wasn't paying very close attention, and all of a sudden I heard the instructor poet say, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas, and I was immediately and I said, say that out loud again, and she said, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And I went, anyone can say, I wish I'd been born a crab. It takes a poet to say, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. I said, who said that? And she said, well, if you'd been listening to my lecture, that's T.S. Eliot, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And it was from that point on that I began to be haunted in many ways by this poem and by the lines and the rhythms of this poem. We're not going to be able to get through it all, but we're going to begin, and we'll scratch at the surface. Let's just point out a couple of observations that it gets dark and not obvious if you paid any attention at all. The speaker of this poem is a cat named J. Alfred Prufrock. A couple of questions about it for your notes. One, is he young or old? We'll start with the most simple. Is he young or old? How do we know he's old? Because he says so. I grow old, I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Do I dare to eat a peach? When you turn old, if you've spent any time around old people, you know this is true. Once you start getting old, silly things like what you're going to wear and what you're going to eat are what matter. Of course, if you think about it, it makes sense. What else have you got? Right? After you no longer work anymore, you wake up in the morning and you don't got to go anywhere. What else are you going to consume your mind with? So first, he's old. Secondly, notice all of the questions of this poem. As an old man, he's constantly asking questions. Of course, one of the more interesting ones is, do I dare disturb the universe? Now that's an interesting question. The verb dare, to disturb the universe. There's a classic short novel that some of you maybe read when you were children called The Chocolate War by a great writer named Cormier. For those of you who don't know the story, it's a fascinating novel. The young boy of the story, who is our hero, if you wish to call him that, goes to an all-boys school where every year the students are supposed to sell chocolates. Brother Leon, the teacher, is handing out chocolates on the day the sale is to begin. He calls out for the young boy, come to the front to pick up your chocolates. And he goes, no. And the teacher says, I'm sorry, you didn't hear me. Get up here and pick up your chocolates. You have to go out into the community and sell your chocolates just like everybody else to raise money for the school. And again, the young man goes, no. I ain't selling no chocolates. I ain't selling no chocolates. Brother Leon is stunned. He said, you and I will speak after class. And he says, that's fine, but I ain't selling no chocolates. The entire school turns against the one young man who refuses to sell chocolates. They do all kinds of terrible things to him, calling him in the middle of the night, beating him up. The thing that really bugs him the worst is that the entire school, including all of the teachers, spend days ignoring him as if he doesn't exist. He'll walk through the halls of the school, and people look through him as if he's not there. Periodically, he has to skip into the bathroom for a second to make sure he can look in a mirror to make sure he still exists. Nobody acknowledges his existence for days. It starts to mess with his head. He still refuses to sell the chocolates. In his locker, there is a poster of a little boy walking along the ocean side, and the words of the poster say, do I dare disturb the universe? What does it mean when someone asks, do I dare disturb the universe? What does that even mean? Do I dare to do something that what? That's something that is not normal. Do I dare to do something that's unusual? Question. If you ask when you're an old person, do I dare disturb the universe? What does that tell you about what he thinks about his whole life to that point? He hasn't ever disturbed the universe, has he, right? He hasn't disturbed the universe. What kind of life has he lived? Well, it's a life, he says, measured out in coffee spoons. It's a life, are you ready for this word picture? I've seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I've seen the eternal footman, death, hold my coat and snicker. He imagines his life like being at a really nice restaurant, where as he goes out the door, the doorman holds his coat for him. The doorman is death. He's putting his arms into the sleeve of the coat. He's ready to die. And death is holding his coat for him, and as he puts his sleeves in, death laughs at him. He says, and in short, what? I was afraid. Maybe the saddest line of the poem, though, and a lot of juniors have resonated with this one, is when he says, it is impossible to say just what I mean. Have you ever had this feeling? You know what you think, and you want to say it, you just can't find the words. T.S. Eliot will say, this is the modern condition. We know we feel rage, we know we feel sadness, we know we feel alienated, but we can't find the words. In the end, and this is hard for you to accept because you haven't yet studied the play Hamlet, Prufrock will say, I'm not like young Prince Hamlet. I'm not a fighter. I'm not a guy who goes out to avenge the death of my dad. He says, rather, I'm like the old fart in the play Hamlet. Polonius is his name, an old fool. Finally, how does the poem end? This is a tough one. He says he walks along the beach with his trousers rolled up, and he tries to see the mermaids who are singing each to each. But notice what he says, even the mermaids won't call him. But what happens at the end of the poem? What is the last word of this poem? Did you see it?
And drown.
The last word is drowned, which raised a lot of questions about, dude, what's going on at the end of this poem? Prufrock has said earlier, every morning we get up and we prepare a face to meet the faces that we meet. People aren't always what they appear to be. Remember, Freud said as much, right? We put on a face like a mask. One of the more disturbing word pictures is he imagines himself in a bug collection, pinned and wriggling on a wall. You've seen those bug collections where they stick the bug through and then stick it to a piece of cardboard? He imagines his life like that. He says, I'm like a bug that's been stuck to and I'm pinned and wriggling. I want to get free. I can't get free. In the end, he says, I should have been born a pair of ragged claws, scuttling across the floors of silent seas. I should have been a crab at the bottom of the ocean. At the end of the poem, it seems that old man Prufrock will soon be at the bottom of the ocean. Final question. What would be your advice to this old man, Prufrock? Think a little about that. Come back tomorrow. We'll do some more work. Thank you.